Bonjour à tous. Hello, everyone. Good evening for those who are based in Paris and Europe, and good morning or good afternoon for those who are zooming in from the other side of the Atlantic. I'm Alexandra Scheffer. I'm the director of the German Marshall Fund of the United States in Paris, and very, very happy to host all of you for what promises to be a really interesting conversation. I will invite the panelists, Andrea, but also Martin, to put their camera on. There you go. Let me introduce this conversation tonight. First, this event is a part of the US Speaker Series program that many of you have been attending these last few years, which we have been running in partnership with the US Embassy in Paris. And I would really like to thank the US Embassy, its fantastic team, for its support and for a very fruitful partnership. The aim of this US Speaker Series is really to bring American perspectives to Paris, to Europe, to shed some light on some of the most pressing foreign policy issues, and first and foremost, to have a better understanding of what drives US foreign policy, and of course, its implication for France and Europe. So we held several other events similar to this one. We used to do it in person, actually, but because of the COVID situation, we had to turn it virtual, but we had really interesting discussions on US policy towards China, in Africa, the role of the US Congress in US foreign policy making. And this private event, as you know, today will be focusing on the so-called Summit for Democracy that President Biden had already envisioned during his presidential campaign, and that will actually take place next week on December 9th and 10th. The Summit for Democracy has really been one of the foreign policy flagship initiatives of this American administration. The narrative of democracy promotion values in US foreign policy have strongly marked the administration discourse since the beginning of the presidency. And you might remember that President Biden described the aim of his first trip to Europe back in June this year as, I quote, America rallying the world's democracies. So 1 year after the US presidential election, at the eve of the so-called Summit for Democracy, this conversation really aims at offering an assessment of the US policy related to democracy based on a few questions that we will be asking Andrea, and we very much look forward, obviously, to the conversation with many of you attending this event today. Let me present Andrea. Andrea Kendall-Taylor is a senior fellow and director of the Transatlantic Security Program at the CNAS, the Center for New American Security. Her expertise is very well known on national security challenges facing both the United States and Europe, focusing on Russia, authoritarianism, threats to democracy, and the state of the Transatlantic Alliance. So a really great expertise that we can benefit from this evening. Andrea, thank you very much for joining us again today. And my colleague, Martin Conseil, will be then moderating the conversation. You can use the chat box or the Q&A, and we will be selecting, trying to regroup some of the questions and address them to Andrea. I'll stop here. Welcome back, Andrea, and very much looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Alexandra. It's really wonderful to be here. I'm happy to kind of share my views on the Summit for Democracy. Probably no one appreciates when we start with caveats, but just to give a couple of caveats that I've really done my due diligence to try to talk to different officials in the administration so I could kind of have a good sense of what we should expect for the 9th and 10th. But the caveats are, you know, administration is still kind of holding their cards very close to their chest. And I do still think that there's a lot of unknowns in terms of what we should expect. but I am going to do my best to communicate kind of as I understand some of the expectations, themes, deliverables, etc. So still lots of unknowns. I still have lots of questions myself, but I am looking forward to a discussion on this. I think for the Summit for Democracy, the administration has been really clear that they are taking a big tent approach to the summit. The thinking that was explained to me is that it is better to have countries in the tent than not. And so we are seeing a big diversity in the types of countries that are invited. Some countries where democracy appears fragile, some countries where democracy has suffered some setbacks, or where more authoritarian trends have emerged. In terms of deliverables, the Biden administration, I think, has very much framed this as a galvanizing moment, that the summit should be seen as more of a kickoff event, so to speak. And then they see the coming year as really a year of action, when they expect that they'll meet again, hopefully in person, a year from now. And so this will be, setting in motion this year of action, where countries will have an opportunity to develop and deliver on some of the commitments that they make. So the Summit for Democracy, I think, is really the first step, and it's intended to get things going and to galvanize future action. In terms of expectations, I think there will be some commitments, but I think we should have some fairly modest expectations about what those will be. I don't think our expectations should be too high. I do think that the United States will have a number of initiatives that it's coming to the table with. But again, the emphasis is on galvanizing future action. The goal is to use this moment for governments to reaffirm their values and to commit to upholding them. And I think, that there's a question that I'll come back to on civil society, but it's here where civil society, I think, will play a key role. And the message is that, we need civil society to then work to help governments to uphold and to help governments hold civil society to have governments, to hold governments accountable. So the Biden administration is asking governments to develop some commitments. These would be national level commitments that different countries could come to the table with, but they aren't requiring countries to come with any commitments. There's also going to be an opportunity for joint commitments that governments would have an opportunity to sign on to. And I think it's worth remembering that when this was initially conceptualized, they were modeling things on President Obama's nuclear security summit, where countries did come to the table with commitments in hand. But as people were thinking through this, I think they very quickly realized that they're not dealing here with nuclear material, and that actually renewing and restoring democracy can be a lot harder. So there are no commitments that countries are required to come to the table with. Civil society has been, I think, a big point of contention. How much role and how much influence and input they've had into the summit has been something that people have widely talked about in the press. I do think that there has been effort to incorporate civil society input into the event. That's where I think the State Department has been in the lead on engaging civil society, that they have held regular calls with various groups and organizations to solicit their input. But I think one of the key things to remember, and that administration officials will emphasize, is that the summit only runs 2 days. And because it's virtual, it has to span the entire globe in terms of time zones. And so what that means in reality is that there's actually only 2 half-day sessions. And so that makes real estate extremely limited. And there's an awful lot that they're trying to fit into this small space. Obviously, governments are going to want to talk, civil society wants to speak, but there's really only so much space and not enough real estate to fit everything in that everyone will want to see coming out of the summit. There obviously have been calls to allow representatives of civil society and independent media and social movements, especially from countries that aren't invited officially to attend, to have the privilege of speaking directly to attending governments. And I do think there will be some of this. There are, for example, a number of side events. I think I've heard, for example, that there will be a public panel on activists in closed spaces being held on the 6th of December, where we will have a Uyghur and a Russian and Egyptian activist, for example. So there is a little bit of this. But the kind of underlying message is that the administration is very limited in what they're going to be able to accomplish in these two essentially half-day sessions. In terms of key messages and area of focus, I think there's a big push to keep the message positive and to lay out an affirmative vision. And they'll say then that civil society is being put in the seat to work domestically to kind of wag fingers and call out governments where they're falling short on commitments, but they don't want it to be the summit for democracy as the place for naming and shaming and calling out governments for their shortcomings. They do want to kind of keep this more positive tone. And so instead, I think the message that is coming out is clearly that democracy is in crisis, and to underscore how important it is for like-minded countries to come together to lay out this affirmative vision and to show the benefits of the model of our governance. And it's obviously incredibly important at a time when countries like China and Russia are certainly doing their best to convince the world that democracy doesn't deliver. So this is the time to come out and reaffirm and show the world that we believe in our model and what it delivers, and that we actually do have a positive agenda that is being put out there. The administration has announced kind of what the 3 areas of focus will be. The first is counter-corruption. It's also protecting human rights and defending against authoritarianism. But there's also going to be several through lines, I think, through those. There will be a big focus, I think, on the information space. There'll be lots of themes related to creating more resilient information ecosystems, and that includes support for independent media. I think that's one area where we'll see a big push and a significant effort to rally governments to increase support for independent media. I think we could see, for example, commitments to increase funding for media literacy programs. There was a report in the Politico article where we did see some ideas that had been leaked to the press that this could also include an alliance for the future of the internet, but I think it's still unclear to me where exactly this stands and how that might be moved forward in the summit. But another important through line, of course, is going to be technology and technological change, and particularly the intersection of technology and human rights. There may be some efforts on enacting export controls on some dual-use technologies. And then the final through line, I think, will be on strengthening democratic institutions with a focus on elections. I think from an even broader perspective, there have been questions about how this narrative of democracy versus authoritarianism will play out in the context of the summit. That democracy versus authoritarianism is certainly a narrative that President Biden feels very strongly about. I think he views this as the central issue of our time. And in many ways, I think he's right. So whether you're looking at Russian-rooted corruption that permeates our financial systems, or whether you're talking about the Chinese Communist Party's techno-authoritarianism that's basically baked into the apps and the networks that many people use, it's clear that this struggle is systemic and that it requires collective action. I think that's something that at a very kind of high level that this administration believes. But there is also a recognition by others below the president that is not always a narrative that our allies and partners, especially transatlantic partners, always appreciate. They recognize that competition between democracy and authoritarianism can in many ways be an alienating frame. And so I do think that there will be a focus on framing this as a moment to decide again what our values are and our commitment to them, to try to present this with this more affirmative vision rather than framing things as a competition. I think you can certainly expect that President Biden will likely speak in terms of competition, but kind of throughout the rest of it, I do think there will be an effort to keep it affirmative. The other thing is, the administration is really making significant effort to articulate that the Summit for Democracy is not a counter Russia and counter China project. Clearly, Russia and China are framing things this way, and that was really evident. I think most of us probably saw the joint op-ed from the Russian and Chinese ambassadors to the United States that they drafted in the national interest, they are pushing back. They use the op-ed and their rhetoric more broadly to try to push back and accuse the United States really of having this Cold War mentality and to argue against the universality of democratic principles. So, the United States, the Biden administration is trying to say this is not a counter-Russia, counter-China project, while, those two are kind of arguing contrary. But again, so the focus is really about reminding citizens of the strengths of democracy, their ability to deliver, rather than framing it in terms of competition. So I think that's how we're likely to see that narrative play out. And I think then the very last things I want to say is that this administration is going into the summit with a lot of humility. You can see that in, President Blinken early on in the administration gave a speech at State. That is very much, I think, the tone and the tenor of this. The message is that democracy is in crisis, including at home in the United States. And so we all know Freedom House has now documented 15 years of consecutive decline in political rights and civil liberties. So it is very much a tone of humility. And while, the administration and President Biden has talked about his desire to renew US leadership, I think people who are planning the summit are also looking this as an opportunity to try to lift up other leaders around the world. So yes, it is about renewing and reaffirming US leadership, but I do think there is also this effort to try to lift up leaders everywhere. And I think that will kind of hopefully be apparent throughout the summit. So that is my understanding of all of this. And I'm, happy to have a discussion and answer questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrea. And thank you for helping us better understand the Biden's vision behind the summit and some of the expectations that you may hear from DC. I understand also that, as you said at the beginning, there's still many questions as to what will come out of this first summit. And perhaps it's more interesting to look at not just December 9th and 10th, but at this whole year of action that is supposed to be triggered by this first summit. And my first question before going to the Q&A is to you, more personally, what do you think would make it a success if we were to talk about it in a year from now? What is it that you would see as a positive improvement? You mentioned the fact that there are many areas, policy areas that will be discussed, and whether it's tech, internet, the support for activists in different autocratic regimes. If there was one or two initiatives or concrete results from this year of action that you would deem a real success, what would it be?
That is a really hard question. I mean, I do think in many ways that they have honed in on some of the most important issues. So I think the focus that we see on anti-corruption, defending against authoritarianism, that those are, where, and the technology piece are some of the areas where, kind of given how we understand how authoritarianism is adapting and evolving, are the areas where I think we need the most effort to try to kind of put our own house in order and strengthen our own democracies, and B, kind of do things that are responding and adapting to what we see. So in particular, I've done a lot of work on digital authoritarianism and thinking how authoritarian regimes are using technology to increase their grip and hold on power. And so this focus on technological change and the intersection between those two things, I think, is a really important focus. So kind of thinking about what could be some deliverables in those areas. I think these ideas for export controls is a very good one. I think there's probably a whole I think and one of the things that I think where there could be a lot of focus is trying to understand and strengthen kind of legislatures and watchdog organizations in some of the hybrid regimes which are included in the summit. So obviously countries that are purely authoritarian regimes are using technology in really concerning ways. But they're often, to be frank, I think there's limited leverage often that we have over those governments other than export controls and sanctions and some of the other tools that we try to use. But the real battleground seems to be in the hybrid regimes, where some countries are adopting technologies for perfectly legitimate reasons, like public safety, related to the pandemic. But we lack kind of the infrastructure around their use of technology that prevents them from abusing these dual use technologies. So, working with governments to increase legislative restrictions on technology, working with governments to improve and enhance civil society and the watchdog organizations that can shine light on government's abuse of technology. I think things along those lines and in that vein would be some really concrete steps. And then I think the thing that is on their agenda is anti-corruption. And we know that that's something that this administration is taking really seriously. Obviously, with this administration, they've put out the presidential directive calling for an interagency review of what every agency is doing in the anti-corruption domain, and expressing the sentiment that anti-corruption isn't really just a good governance kind of nice to have, that it actually is a national security issue. And we know that this administration at USAID, with their task force on anti-corruption, there's a lot going on in the US Congress on the kind of counter kleptocracy caucus. I think there's a lot of positive energy. And so over the next year, passing some of that US legislation, ramping up USAID efforts in these areas, those would also be really positive steps, but then working with allies and partners to try to do that in a more unified and cohesive way. So I think those are two areas that would be really wonderful. And I think, like, when we think about success, we have the list of countries that has been invited to involve. I think one indicator of success could be that if that list expands or grows, that if we actually see other countries around the world who are, who might not have been included this year, but are looking to kind of make some changes or put forward some commitments that would then enable them to be included at a future. So, one of the things that in my conversations is that is consistent with this idea of an affirmative agenda is that, they'll say that they want to create a race to the top kind of mentality. And so if we could see kind of a widening of the tent, even in the sense that you have countries who are enthusiastic about what they've seen, about some of the initiatives that the Summit for Democracy has put forward, and are looking to join at a later date, I think that would be a really wonderful sign of success.
Well, thank you. It's been actually, you've managed to answer perfectly this difficult question, as you said. Let me take maybe a couple of questions from the Q&A, and I'll try to regroup some questions together. The first one actually is just a reminder that this summit obviously happens as we're still struggling with the COVID pandemic, and in many of our countries, in fact, facing a new wave of COVID. Is the impact of COVID on democracy on the agenda for this summit? And what will President Biden say about the dangers the pandemic has posed to trust in democratic institutions? It's true that this is something that I guess will be discussed, but if you could perhaps elaborate a bit on this relationship between COVID and democracy. And the second is there's a series of questions on the choices that were made by the Biden administration to include or not certain countries. I would say there are perhaps two different questions here. One more on Europe and on NATO, with the choice to include a country like Poland, but to not include Hungary and Turkey. What do you think could be the implications of that choice for the alliance? And what does it say about the future of US-Hungary and US-Turkey relationship? And the second part of this question has to do with countries that have been assessed as unfree by Freedom House and yet invited, namely the Democratic Republic of Congo, Iraq, and Angola. How do you explain exactly the fact that the Biden administration has used this sort of big tent approach for these countries?
Okay, lots of very good questions. So I can talk, maybe I'll start with the second question first and try to talk a little bit about the selection list. And again, like hear that caveat of that the administration has held its cards very close to its chest. I think there's not a lot of good visibility into the kind of process that they used for selecting countries. Based on my understanding, the Biden administration started with an internal effort of kind of ranking countries in different tiers, so to speak, based on level of democraticness. And I think in that initial process, they leaned very heavily on external indicators, Freedom House, Polity, other indicators of democracy, so that they could have some sort of external validation for the choices that they made. And so that, they basically started with kind of a straw man list. And then we have to remember then that this goes into an interagency process where there's a lot of kind of internal wrangling, agencies that have different interests and advocating for different reasons for which countries maybe should not be included, which countries should be included. And really kind of, I don't have any particular insight into how all of that unfolded through this kind of interagency process. I think still from the outside, in many ways, it kind of did go into a black box and we don't understand the process exactly. And then you get the list on the back end. I think I would direct people to, there was a really great op-ed by Stephen Feldstein at Carnegie, who tried to shed some insight into kind of the different lists and maybe some of the factors that went into those decisions. And so, for example, he definitely highlighted that 8 countries actually fall very low on democracy rankings. That does raise troubling questions about their invitations, some that you listed, but there are also others. There are also, as you noted, several countries where you have seen a lot of backsliding in recent years, and Poland would be on that list, but also Brazil, India, Philippines. But I do think that there are some kind of consideration. It would have been, there's no way that India, for example, was not going to be invited, given its importance to the United States, despite the fact that there have been some concerning trends. So from a kind of US foreign policy perspective, looking at allies and partners and countries that we would need at the table, I think there were some kind of not purely, not all of this was the democracy purists deciding who should be in and out, that there were other considerations that often were able to creep in. And so that there were in many ways broader US strategic interests that mattered. So I think another factor is upcoming elections where there was maybe the potential for big leadership change. This is something that Stephen talks about. And so for countries like Kenya and elsewhere, in Philippines included, that might have been one of the reasons, if you can get them to come to the table, have some of these commitments, that maybe that might affect the outcome of an election. In some cases, I think that worked in the opposite direction. And I think that's probably the case with Hungary, where I understand there may have been some concerns that because Hungary has an upcoming election, that allowing Orban to participate in the Summit for Democracies could work in the other direction and kind of legitimate him as a leader inside Hungary. And so that might have been one of the factors that helped differentiate between Hungary and Poland. I think it's also worth underscoring that Hungary and Poland are in different places. And although there are some concerning trends in Poland, Hungary is at a relatively different spot on the democracy scale. So it's, I think, there's different levels and kind of where they are in the backsliding process, where Hungary is obviously outpaced Poland, but I think Hungary's election might have also played a role there. And then the final thing I would say, just in terms of selection, and I had heard that there was some kind of back and forth between the Biden administration and some potentially participating countries. So where that there was a little bit of give and take, some dialogue and discussion, so that that countries maybe also played some role in terms of their enthusiasm or willingness to want to be able to sign up to maybe some of the commitments that the Biden team is considering, may have opted out on their end as well. So I do think that it is possible that it wasn't entirely the Biden administration just sitting back and making decisions about who's in and who's out, but that in some cases there was some back and forth, and that it might not have been entirely a one-way street. So I think there's probably a lot of different factors that went into the list. It's really worth remembering, it's hard. I mean, even from an academic perspective, making decisions about how you code countries as democracy versus non-democracy, there are a lot of countries where there are difficult, hard decisions that have to be made. And so I sympathize actually with the Biden administration in having to make these choices. Democracy is messy. These processes are messy. There's a lot of different considerations. And so that was a very difficult process. I think we can all kind of have gripes with who's in and who's out, but let's just remember, that it's hard. That's hard work. Okay, on the other question about COVID, I don't have a good sense of exactly how the Summit for Democracy will take on that issue, other than kind of recognizing that when we're talking about the state of democracy and the challenges to it, that COVID certainly is one of those things that's raised concerns, particularly, I think, well, on the technology realm and kind of government's use of technology and surveillance and tracking, and whether or not that opens the door for government's inappropriate and misuse of some of these technologies. But I also think there's kind of a deeper piece of it, which is kind of just the frustration, dissatisfaction, economic hardship that many governments are facing as a result of COVID that can kind of increase citizen dissatisfaction with the way that democracy delivers. And so, I mean, those are all considerations to think about. I'll just to be very candid, I don't have a good sense of how that theme is likely to play in the Summit for Democracy. But given this administration's focus on COVID, we remember that their three priorities very much have been China, climate, and COVID. I would imagine that would give some prominence in themes and the way that they talk about and its effect on democracy.
Yes, when you mentioned the fact that the countries were asked to take some commitments, we could perhaps imagine that countries would commit to lift the measures that have been taken during the COVID pandemic once the health situation is better. Maybe let me go back to the Q&A. There is a question quite specific on the summit and NATO. The NATO Reflection Group last year had suggested the creation of a Center of Excellence for Democratic Resilience. How do you see the summit and the commitment of the Biden administration to the effort against democratic decline and perhaps the work that is being done at NATO and on the road to the NATO strategic concept? Is there an interest in sort of articulating perhaps these two, this effort, not only in the summit itself, but also through other platforms such as NATO? Another question is on US commitment at the domestic level. Obviously, and you mentioned that at the beginning, the US is also dealing and facing its own issues with regards to democracy at home. What do you think the Biden administration could announce during the summit? Is there something more precise that could be said about this? And also, to what extent you can sort of put all the countries together here, because one issue that can be very specific to the US, say the financing of political groups or campaign financing legislation, may not be that relevant for other countries in the summit. So how do you think they will sort of manage the differences within these the countries included?
Okay, those are really excellent questions. On the kind of NATO question, I mean, and I guess this gets at the second question too. So, I mean, clearly, I think I would say a key focus of the Summit for Democracy is on resilience. I think, if we're talking about the difference between kind of resilience versus going out and promoting democracy, this will be squarely in the camp of we need to get our own house in order. And I think that's been really clear from how President Biden and other senior officials in the Biden administration has thought about this problem, that, in order to be competitive against countries like China and Russia, we do very much need to get our own house in order. And we need to do that kind of at the same time as we're expressing support for activists in closed spaces in other places. So, I mean, and I guess I should say, so the focus is on resilience and getting the own house in order. That doesn't mean that they have totally walked away with, I think, supporting and promoting democracy elsewhere, because we see signs that we might have activists from closed spaces like Russia, Uyghurs, Egyptians, and others. Like, there is still a recognition that we need to kind of shine a light on their efforts, create an international context that's conducive to the work that they are doing at home, and try to, protect the human rights of those activists who are fighting for democracy in other countries. So, but if we were talking about a balance between those two, I think the by and large, the focus is very much on the let's get our own houses in order part of this. And you can kind of see that in strengthening democratic institutions, countering corruption. Those are the kind of the key themes. So how does that relate to NATO? I mean, I think that, well, that is also, those are conversations that we're kind of having regularly with allies and partners. So when we're talking about kind of pushing back against a Russian malign authoritarian influence in particular, there has been a lot of focus on cyber resilience, for example, and information space resilience and all of those things. So, I mean, I think this in many ways will mirror and be complementary to the conversations that we're having with our democratic allies and partners within the NATO context. So it's kind of the Summit of Democracy is meant to be this rallying, galvanizing moment. But then I think the United States is looking for more kind of flexible groupings in order to actually advance many of the things that they are affirming, right? So I don't think that it's that they're looking for big kind of commitments with all of the countries that have attended, but rather it's reminding ourselves why democracy matters, why it's important, and what are our commitments to upholding these values. And then they're looking to flexible groupings. So it could be through NATO, but things like the Trade and Technology Council, where I think a lot of these themes will be carried over. Looking to things like the Quad to advance a lot of these things. So although, they're bringing together the world's democracies, it does seem like the way that they are looking to kind of implement seems to be in more of these flexible groupings of countries who are involved. And that I think is relevant to the second question about, countries are in very different places. And so kind of campaign finance laws that are appropriate in the United States are not, relevant or appropriate elsewhere. So what I think they're looking to do is they're highlighting the central issues that they think the world and our liberal democracies need to focus on. And I actually think that they're looking for countries to come with national level commitments. So for the United States, we could commit to doing campaign finance reform or other things that are appropriate to our own political context. So that was my point earlier about also the role of civil society. So I think they want national governments to kind of, under the broad themes that they're focused on, what are national level commitments that governments can make? And then also trying to work, and it actually puts quite a lot of onus on civil society then to be the ones who are looking to hold governments accountable to those national level commitments that have been made, and to call out and shine a light when those commitments are not upheld. So I think under these broad themes that different governments might have different commitments that they make, as long as they're kind of in the spirit and in keeping with advancing those key objectives. And on the domestic front, I mean, there are a number of things. I think that we're likely to see the anti-corruption is one area. Campaign finance might get at that. Independent media is another area where we could see kind of domestic level commitments. But again, I think the goal is there are likely to be larger commitments that different governments might sign on to that might be broader kind of at a higher level. But I do think that they are wanting governments to come with their own specific national commitments that would fall under each of these different themes.
Thank you. In a way, there's a question about what happens after the summit. So you mentioned the fact that the civil society would have a role in sort of monitoring the implementation. Are they, do you know if there are any other implementation mechanisms that is being discussed during this year of action? Any sort of other meetings maybe, or summit happening before the one next year to assess the evolution in the different countries? And also maybe at the US level, who personally or institutionally would be leading the US effort, the administration effort during this year of action? Will it be sort of a project led by the president himself, or will there be some sort of a coordinator designated in the US for the year to come? Another question now on you mentioned the fact that there could be a side event with activists, if I understand. Do you think they, and I'm sorry if you mentioned that, but beyond, activists from Russia or China, could there be activists from the very countries that are, say, NATO ally but not invited? And in which case, again, what kind of message would it send to Ankara or Budapest if there were activists, democracy activists invited to the summit? And then there are a few questions on the US-China competition, but perhaps I'll get back to that afterwards.
Okay. So, I mean, to be very frank on your question about what's next in this year of action, I don't think that the administration itself has really gotten there. Obviously, we know that this has been a really difficult endeavor to pull off. That the administration has worked really hard with different fits and starts about figuring out kind of who should come and what should be the key themes and how are they going to orchestrate all of this. And I think part of the reason that we have so many questions about kind of what's on the agenda and who's attending and all of these things is because they are really kind of down to the wire, finishing up with a lot of these key details. And so I think it's fair to say that there has probably not been a lot of thought given to what happens next in the year of action. So I myself have not heard about whether, who will have the lead for the year of action, whether there will be a coordinator. I think those are really all excellent questions, but nothing, I don't have any special insight into any of those. I do think that they're going to still be working through some of these key details to understand how to keep momentum in the coming year so that they can have a very special event in 1 year's time. So I think a lot of that will be on the table and up for discussion as they pivot from this galvanizing moment into this year of action. So unfortunately, I can't shed any special insight into that. In terms of activists from potentially, like allied members who aren't involved, well, it's not allies, but I think, having kind of Belarusian participation, for example, we should certainly see that. But I think so far that falls under kind of supporting activists in closed spaces. That has been a particular focus of the administration and where we can expect to see a side event. But I don't have any insight, unfortunately. I'm sorry to keep saying this over and over, but in terms of, will there be Hungarian or Turkish activists? I don't know how that will be handled.
No, in a way.
All good questions, yeah.
No, of course, in a way, you said it at the beginning, and that the fact that it was sort of kept secret, the whole process and preparation to the summit has been, it's been very difficult to get any information so far, says a lot about the whole, all the uncertainties that are still there and the question marks that we have to answer. Let me get to the US-China question. And one is on whether you see any discrepancies between the sort of China containment coalition that the US has tried to build more on the geopolitical side, and the group of countries that is invited to this democracy summit. Meaning, are there countries that will be invited, but still sort of side with China on geopolitical matters? And do you think that the US will sort of accept, or how will it sort of react to having countries be soft on China and at the same time participating in this effort on the Summit for Democracy? And the second question is perhaps to have you elaborate a bit more on something you mentioned at the very beginning, which is that European partners are quite uncomfortable with the democracy versus autocracy narrative. In a way, the argument in Europe is that as much as Europe is in a systemic rivalry with China, it is not obviously facing the same kind of geopolitical competition that the US is facing. And that is perhaps not even related to democracy in China, that the US and China are now competing at the global level. How do you think this argument can be answered by the Biden administration? Will there be some sort of further discussion between Europeans and the US on this narrative and how to better reconcile the two visions there?
Okay, so maybe I'll take that second one first. And I mean, so I guess the kind of overarching frame in answering both of these questions is just reminding people, how much the administration wants people not to understand this in terms of competition with China. Like, they will go to great pains to tell you that this is not the counter-China, counter-Russia coalition, and that we have a much more kind of affirmative vision for what we're trying to accomplish. So I think that's really important to remember. In terms of how we can talk with Europe on this, I do think that is, so obviously President Biden believes very much in framing this current moment as a kind of strategic competition between systems. But there, again, as I was saying in my remarks, I think the administration has also heard loud and clear about how alienating that can be to allies and partners. And so I think, have seen the administration shift from Secretary of State Blinken was explicit, like, we are not going to force anyone to pick a side. And so now that they are now kind of moving towards more pragmatic engagement through initiatives like the Trade and Technology Council, where we are taking steps to both enhance our protectiveness, protect our systems and our ecosystems from malign authoritarian influence from countries like China, but doing it without the banner of competition. So we can take these pragmatic steps. They can be actor agnostic. They're things that we should be doing purely to strengthen our own systems, accelerate and increase our own innovation, make us more competitive through things like the Trade and Technology Council, without framing it through that China lens. So I think it's my sense that as these dialogues and these conversations move forward, it will be framed much more in terms of these are the pragmatic steps we can take, recognizing that when we do take them, they have the same outcome, right? They still do the things that the Biden administration is hoping, if they want to view it in that competitive lens. So that's largely my sense. And then there, obviously in other venues like NATO, China has moved on to the priority list in a really important way. So I think from the US administration's perspective, there's been a lot of progress on getting China, or getting Europe, to a closer view of the way that we see the China challenge also. So I think there's been some very positive steps taken in that direction, and a recognition that we can do the things that we need to do without having such an ideological lens on it. In terms of the countries, whether or not, again, it's not a counter-China thing, so I don't think we should think of the summit as, part of this containment strategy. I think your question about might there be some countries included that have a proclivity to have warmer ties with China, I don't think that would be I actually would think that might be a further reason why we would want them in the tent. It goes back to that mentality of we want to cast a wide net. We would rather have countries in the tent than out. And if we can kind of take these pragmatic steps to enhance democratic resilience, especially in countries that are a little bit kind of in the crosshairs in this competition between China and the United States, if we want to view it that way, that by having them in the tent and signing up to some of these commitments, that it can increase the resilience of those countries that might then be at risk of kind of sliding backwards, given the alternative that China poses. I mean, that is one of the big factors, I think, that is driving democratic waves is countries that maybe can't get money or assistance or other, the kind of dissatisfaction with conditionality, that because countries now can credibly say, well, I can go to China in particular to get the support that I might have gotten in the West, and that came with some conditions. So that conditionality, that's something now that these countries can use against, and it works to dilute US influence and Western and democratic influence in some of those countries. So if we can have some of those countries at this moment inside the tent and taking some small steps that enhance their resilience, I think that's probably what the Summit for Democracy is looking to accomplish.
Thank you. And you answer in a way some other questions. I see that there were questions about whether the good economic relationship between Hungary and China may have influenced the decision of the Biden administration to invite Hungary to the Summit of Democracy, but you explained that it's something that you would rather decouple in the thinking. Let me get to maybe one or two final questions. There's one which I thought was interesting as well, that the Summit for Democracy is, I guess, also meant to address some of the concerns or priorities of the US domestic population, that it's also sort of a PR initiative for the Biden administration. Now, what do you think, how do you think the Biden administration will use the summit for its own sort of domestic agenda on democracy and the fight against democratic decline in the US? And in other countries, there's a question as on the fact that in some countries, young people have lived all their life in systems that are, let's say, imperfect. And how do you think the summit can show that democracy delivers, that inspires some sort of hope for democracy in countries that are invited, but have faced major issues there?
Okay, those are hard questions.
Yes, sorry.
Okay, so I'm on the domestic front. I mean, I think absolutely this President Biden will look to use this to kind of reaffirm his commitment to strengthening democracy at home. You'll remember after kind of the January 6th Capitol riots, I think there was a lot of internal debate within the United States about whether or not we should can the Summit for Democracies, like the international focus, and actually do something that focused squarely on our own situation inside, that there was a recognition that we too were on the precipice, that we were put to the test. And there was a lot that we need to do to strengthen our own democracy. And, a lot of calls to say, well, shouldn't we focus domestically and here at home before we're working with other governments even? So, I mean, I think this is, it very much is part of the domestic discourse. And I think President Biden has come in trying his hardest to appeal to both sides of the aisle. And hopefully this question of democracy is one of those things that he's hoping to use to kind of bridge the divide that we see that has widened so significantly within the United States. And so he can kind of come in and use this and talk about how he is working to strengthen US democracy that has been tested. And so with the focus on anti-corruption and supporting independent media all across the United States, where we've seen kind of small independent media kind of go by the wayside, and how do we kind of reignite and reinvigorate independent media across our countries of these trusted sources of information for more Americans, strengthening institutions and especially our electoral institutions. Those are all things that are on the Biden administration's domestic agenda. And so I think will use this just to try to reestablish, reinvigorate, and kind of give greater legitimacy to his efforts as the US president to strengthen US democracy. That's something that has been important to him all along. There is a lot of collaboration, I think, within the NSC between the domestic and the foreign policy teams, kind of trying to weave these pieces together. And I think there is a recognition that, in domestic and foreign policy cannot so easily be separated, given the kind of attacks on democracy that we see from Russia, from China, and that our own sources of weakness are things that external actors can then exploit. So this administration definitely recognizes that we can't neatly separate the two, domestic and foreign policy, that they're integral. And so this is an issue, the Summit for Democracy, that I think crosses across both of those lines. The question is kind of, how successful can he be in showing all Americans this? And I think that's one instance where kind of with the severe polarization that we see now, I think he's going to have I think this is likely to be something that's upheld and heralded by the Democrats and maybe is, heavily criticized and kind of downplayed by the Republicans. So, the extent to which he can use this to kind of speak broadly to all Americans, he'll try to do it. But the question is, how resonant will that be with all parts of US societies? That's an outstanding question. And then I think that last question about kind of how can we show that democracies will deliver, I think that's likely to be one of the shortcomings of the summit. I think there's likely to be a lot of kind of commitments on things like, strengthening independent media and other things. But what we're seeing by and large is in a lot of places, citizens, not perceiving that democracy delivers, and that, even though this will be a year of action, I'm not sure how much teeth the initiatives will have, and whether or not the things that governments sign up to and the commitments that they make will actually kind of be able to reach down and affect citizens' lives in ways that gets them to see, the benefits of democracy. That's really kind of, that's the place that we're in right now. In terms of the competition between authoritarianism and democracy. This will be a galvanizing moment, but I think the jury is still out on whether or not the summit will actually do the hard things that shape citizens' perceptions of their own democracies. And there are a lot of calls, and I read Anne Applebaum's really excellent piece on the bad guys are winning. She has a series of things at the end where she talks about what it is that the summit could do to try to actually shape citizens' perceptions and get people to recognize and understand that democracy truly is the best form of government and bring citizens along. So I think that's where the rubber will meet the road, and that's where I think there's probably the most outstanding questions about what the summit will actually deliver in the end.
Thank you very much. Well, look, it's been really interesting, and I'm sorry to have so many tough questions for you. This is a tough.
Yeah, they're tough issues.
yes, absolutely. But I understand also that perhaps the willingness in DC to sort of manage expectations before the summit because of all of these questions that actually we've mentioned today. And one of the final questions here I read is President Biden being naive before? So we'll have to see, and I hope we'll have a chance to continue this discussion with you and others at GMF. I want to thank you really for having spoken today at this event. To thank again the US Embassy in Paris for their support. I wish you all a very good day. I am really happy we've had a chance to discuss this with you, and we'll see in a bit more than a week what are the results of this first summit. GMF will continue to work on this issue, obviously, in the weeks and months to come, and we hope to see you perhaps in person for our future events. Thank you very much, Andrea, and thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.